Oké, welkom terug iedereen. Ja, we gaan over naar de volgende spreker van vanavond. Nogmaals vermeld ik er even bij, stel gerust jullie vragen in de chatfunctie en dan leggen we die voor aan de spreker op het einde. Ja, heeft u binnenkort een Tinder-date, een romantisch etentje, loop dan niet weg. Met de volgende spreker brengen wij namelijk een primeur binnen in jullie woonkamer. Psychologieprofessor David M. Buss wordt beschouwd als een van de grondleggers in de evolutionaire psychologie. Hij werkte al voor de universiteiten van Michigan, Harvard en nu Texas. Hij doet onderzoek naar onder andere paringsstrategieën, conflicten tussen de seksen, jaloezie en moord. En vanavond vertelt hij over zijn laatste, meest recente boek, When Men Behave Badly. Zet je schrap voor een eengemaakte theorie over seksueel conflict, met hier en daar tips en tricks aan ieder van ons die liever conflict wil vermijden. That was my introduction in Dutch. Dear Professor Buss, welcome to our annual night of the Vrijdenker. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Let's see, I'm just going to try to share the screen here. Let's see if I can do this share screen. Okay. Okay, well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And thank you for inviting me to be at this event and to talk to you. And I think my talk follows very nicely on Alice Dreger's talk, which I thought was wonderful. And we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens there. So what I want to talk about is the topic of conflict between the sexes, basically the ways in which men and women harm each other, torture each other, upset each other as they go through their day-to-day lives, mostly in mating contexts. And this is based on my new book, which is called, in the UK edition, and probably my guess is it's the edition that will be available to most Europeans, is Bad Men: The Hidden Roots of Sexual Deception, Harassment, and Assault. And in the United States, it was published under the title When Men Behave Badly: The Hidden Roots of Sexual Deception, Harassment, and Assault. And they're basically the same book with different titles. And if someone's interested, I can explain why they're different titles. So the title was changed in the UK edition for basically historical reasons. So, sex differences is something I'm going to talk about, and I guess this has become one of the taboo topics to talk about, but I think that they're extremely important to talk about for reasons that I'll get into, and that is that when it comes to sexual violence, which I will define momentarily, when it comes to sexual violence, men are primarily the perpetrators and women primarily the victims of sexual violence, especially in the extreme forms of it. Now, not exclusively, and I do talk about when women behave badly in this domain, and they do in some contexts, but the more extreme you get, the more men tend to have a monopoly on it. So here's just a couple recent examples that have made the news. Harvey Weinstein, Jeffrey Epstein, and so forth, of different levels of sexual harassment and assault. But where are the women? There aren't any women who have made these national and international news due to their repeated serial forms of sexual coercion. And I don't think it's because the news agencies are reluctant to express it. I mean, the one exception perhaps is Ghislaine Maxwell, who was accused of being a facilitator of Jeffrey Epstein. But there's clearly a huge sex difference in this. I'm going to argue that sexual violence against women is the most widespread human rights problem in the world. And what I mean by that is that in Western cultures, we have typically, in most countries, fundamental human rights: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of peaceable assembly. And I would argue that that a human right should be the right to decide on sexual choice. That is, the right to decide when, where, with whom, and under what circumstances a person agrees to have sex with someone else. And the reason that I argue that it's the most widespread human rights problem in the world is that interference with sexual choice it occurs in every culture, in every ethnic group, in every political system, within every religious group, and it affects 50% of the population, half the population that is most likely to become victims of sexual violence. Now, the range of types of sexual violence is truly staggering, and that's why these topics are often treated as though they are entirely separate or independent topics, but they are united in that in my new book, I try to provide an integrative theory to explain why these different forms of sexual violence exist and why we need to combat them. So they range from things like unwanted sexual attention, the catcalls, leering, grope, and so forth, non-consensual touching, sexual harassment, deception, which is particularly important in internet dating sites, intimate partner violence, stalking, revenge porn. And there's a recent case in the news about that. A mayor in a United States city was posted revenge porn photos, or was accused of posting revenge photos of his wife who dumped him. Various forms of rape, honor killing, sex trafficking, and so forth. My only point here is that the range of types of sexual violence is truly staggering. And if you add them all up, it amounts to a substantial problem that we have to deal with, and we need to understand the causes of sexual violence in order to create cures for it. Now, how prevalent are the victims? Of course, the scientific studies bounce all over the place depending on where you do them, who's doing them, the method that they use, what kind of anonymity is assured, and so forth. And so don't take these numbers to be written in stone, but these are just ballpark estimates. That 59% of women have been sexually harassed at some point in their lives. I pick out Canada because Canada is an unusually nonviolent culture, but still there's a lifetime prevalence rate of 27% of women who experience intimate partner violence. Stalking, rape, or attempted rape, there's a lot of controversy about these statistics, and again, depends on the study, the method, how broadly or narrowly you define it. But whatever the figures are, it still amounts to a substantial percentage of and number of sheer victims of this. And then revenge porn, which is just starting to be studied empirically. It's a novel form of sexual violence. We know, and I won't go into this in detail, but we know. And I was shocked at the amount of scientific evidence of how damaging sexual violence is. So to self-esteem, triggers of depression, anxiety, eating disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. I'm going to come back to that one a bit later. Work and school impairment, suicidal ideation, and so forth. So the harms are very great. And even if we consider that the primary victims of sexual violence are, let's say, half of the population, that there are also secondary victims that are rarely considered. So that is the female friends, the male friends of the victims, work colleagues, romantic partners, family members, and women who are not themselves primary victims, but who live in fear of sexual violence. And there's a ton of evidence for this. And so if we consider the sheer number of victims and the range of secondary victims, we're dealing with a pretty substantial problem, and what I argue is a pretty substantial human rights violation. Now, why is it a human rights violation? Well, those of you who know my work know that I adopt an evolutionary perspective, and this goes back to the theory of sexual selection by Charles Darwin, 1871, which I think is perhaps the most important theory when it comes to understanding human mating strategies, and indeed the mating strategies of all sexually reproducing species. And basically what sexual selection deals with, for those who are unfamiliar with it, is the evolution of characteristics, not because of their survival advantage, but rather because of their mating advantage, mating success rather than survival success. And Darwin identified two component processes by which this can occur, and these processes have expanded a bit depending on whether you're a lumper or a splitter, and it's become a very important theory in, as I said, understanding the mating systems of all sexually reproducing species, of which of course humans are one. But one is preferential mate choice. That is, if there's some consensus among members of one sex, some agreement about what qualities they desire in members of the opposite sex, then those who possess the desired qualities have a mating advantage. They get selectively chosen. Those lacking the desired qualities get excluded, shunned, banished, or in modern terms, sometimes become incels, involuntarily celibate individuals. And then so the logic is very simple, but it's whatever qualities, consensual qualities are preferred, those preferred qualities, if there's some heritable basis, they increase in frequency over time. And so you see evolution, which is simply change over time as a result of preferential mate choice. The second component is same-sex competition, which Darwin talked about primarily in the context of contest competition, where there's literally a physical battle between two males, typically, say two stags locking horns in combat, with the victor gaining sexual access to the female, loser ambling off, dejected, with broken antlers, suffering from self-esteem and needing mate value rehabilitation therapy, perhaps. And the logic there is also very simple, but very powerful. And that is whatever qualities lead to success in these same-sex battles, those qualities get passed on in greater numbers over evolutionary time due to the increased sexual access that the victors gain. Qualities associated with losing the battles basically bite the evolutionary dust. Now, we know now that although that contest competition is just one form of same-sex competition, so in the human case, so the logic is more general. In the human case, for example, we compete for position in status hierarchies. And so competition for position in status hierarchies doesn't necessarily involve, and actually doesn't typically involve in most cultures, this physical contest. But nonetheless, these qualities are preferred. Those who gain status have preferential access to desirable mates. And so this process of sexual selection is very, very powerful. And so I regard female choice or preferential mate choice, preferential sexual choice, as perhaps the first mating strategy, and especially the first law of human mating. That is the desire to decide when, where, with whom, and under what circumstances someone consents to have sex. And the forms of sexual violence that I'm going to be talking about are united in that they are all attempts to bypass female choice. Now, can an evolutionary perspective help? And I'm going to argue that it can, because it's going to help to identify the causes of sexual violence, the context in which it occurs, and specifically which men, in this case, are perpetrating it, because it's not all men. And so my book is not about male bashing. It's, in fact, identifies a subset of men who are most likely to commit acts of sexual violence. So now, when did sexual conflict start? Well, it started somewhere between, we'll say, 1 and 2 billion years ago with the evolution of sexual reproduction itself. So we know that life on Earth existed for a couple billion years as asexually reproducing species, but 1 to 2 billion years ago, sexual reproduction evolved. And once you have sexual reproduction, you have a division of labor, if you will, where one sex evolves to be the high investing sex, and the other sex evolves to be the lower investing sex. Now, this is an oversimplification, because when it comes to humans, we have this menu of mating strategies where sometimes both sexes invest a lot, sometimes mating strategies where both sexes invest very little, and sometimes there's a conflict between the two. But nonetheless, even just starting from, in the human case, the sperm and the egg, sperm are very tiny, and there are millions of them. They're basically small packets of DNA with an outboard motor designed for swimming speed to rapidly progress to that nutrient-rich, large, valuable egg, and then penetrate the cortex of the egg, which then basically the female's egg has adaptations to shut down once one sperm penetrates that cortex, and to prevent what's called polyspermy, that is, multiple sperm getting in there and messing up with the system. So now, a key concept is going to be what's called sexually antagonistic coevolution. And the analogy here is with arms races between species. So mostly when we think about coevolutionary arms races, most people think about predators and prey, or parasites and hosts, where each increment in the speed and agility of a predator that favors increments in speed and agility of prey, because basically the slower and less fleet of foot prey get eaten for dinner. The predators, who are a little slower or less fleet of foot, a little less athletic, they starve to death. And so there's this constant coevolutionary arms race between predators and prey. In this example, the impalas and cheetahs, which are predators and prey. But the logic applies to between sex differences in optima, which I'll define momentarily. Conflict between the sexes resulting in coevolutionary arms races within our species, not between species, within our species, between males and females. And I use just an example. You can pick a million examples from anywhere in the insect or mammalian or primate world, but this is one example where male spiders give female spiders gifts of prey, basically a meal, typically a dead insect, wrapped in silk to increase their mating success. Wrapping the gift in silk prevents the female from stealing it without copulating, but sometimes the male, if he can't find a delectable meal to wrap in the silk, he puts a piece of trash in the silk and tries to deceive the female into believing, slight anthropomorphism here, believing that there's a juicy meal within that silk when there in fact is not. Females in turn have developed adaptations to detect through olfactory cues whether there in fact is a delectable meal in there. And so males will sometimes eat a meal themselves and then have like the dregs, the remnants of the meal, which they'll put in the silk to try to fool the female into believing that there in fact is a meal in there. The key point is that there are all these adaptations and counter adaptations within this spider species that is occurring between males and females. Now, one way to think about this is that on any given dimension, if there are differing male and female optima, then and these recur generation after generation, then that will create what I call zones of conflict. So this is just one hypothetical example. Time elapsed before seeking sexual intercourse. So in this example, let's say the male optimum is to let less time elapse before seeking sexual intercourse. The female optimum is to allow more time to elapse, perhaps providing a greater window into deciding preferential mate choice. Is this partner a good sexual partner or mating partner for me? And so if these differing male and female optima occur, then what that means is that selection will create adaptations in males to try to manipulate or influence females to be closer to their optimum, and conversely, adaptations in females to influence or manipulate males to be closer to their optimum. And again, you will have, just like predators and prey, these coevolutionary arms races or sexually antagonistic coevolution between males and females, where they will evolve different adaptations. Amount of investment before sexual intercourse, same sort of logic. Mate value discrepancies. Let's say the female on the crude American mate value scale. I don't know whether Europeans or Belgians typically use this scale or not, but in America, it's crudely referred to as this person's a 10 or an 8 or a 6 or a 4 or a 2 or a 1. But mate value discrepancies turn out to be very important to the degree that there are consensual evaluations of someone's mate value. So let's say hypothetically the woman is an 8 in mate value, the guy is a 6. Well, this creates a zone of conflict, especially if the guy is self-deceived about his own mate value. And as I'm going to show you, men often are. That is, if they're a 6, they think they're an 8, and so often become enraged when they are rejected by a woman who is consensually higher in mate value, and is this guy's not under consideration as a potential mate, but from his perspective, he should be. So mate value discrepancies can cause is another zone of conflict. And this is just another way of kind of depicting these coevolutionary arms races where, let's say you have an adaptation in males for sexual persistence. This will result, if it bypasses female choice, that persistence will result in a decline in the fitness of females. And by fitness, I just mean in an evolutionary sense of reproductive success. That is, she gets basically coerced into mating with someone who is suboptimal from her perspective. And then this will create adaptations in women to resist that persistence, so female sexual resistance adaptations or defenses to prevent becoming a victim of that sexual persistence, which will result in a decline in the fitness of males pursuing that persistent strategy and so forth. So you see these coevolutionary processes again occur. Now, sex differences in human reproductive biology. Women are valuable, and this is just a fact. I've already mentioned the sperm and the egg. You have this nutrient-rich egg, and another. This is an oversimplification, but one way that people use to refer to this is sperm are cheap, eggs are expensive, and they are. And in the human case, women have also this 9-month period of obligatory parental investment, the pregnancy, the incubation of that fetus for 9 months, which is metabolically expensive, also expensive in terms of opportunity costs. And these are just part of our reproductive biology. The part of human reproductive biology. Women don't have a choice. They can't say, I'm very busy with my career right now. I actually would prefer only to invest 2.5 months or 4.5 months. It's just that 9-month on average is obligatory. And so these are some of the important sex differences, and there are a number of them. So internal female fertilization occurs within females, not within males. That's not true of all species, but it's true of our species, which creates problems of paternity uncertainty for men that no woman has ever faced. So as far as I'm aware, no woman has ever given birth, and as the child is emerging from her body, wonders, gee, is this kid really my own? She knows that it is her baby, whereas men can never be sure. So some cultures use the phrase, mama's baby, papa's maybe, to capture that asymmetry. The obligatory parental investment, which I mentioned, functional mammary glands, body fat distribution differs dramatically, not pre-pubertally, but post-pubertally. Concealed ovulation or relatively concealed ovulation in humans, cyclic ovulation, and then fertility curves over the lifespan differ between the sexes. So this is just one example of that, where men can remain fertile and often do remain fertile for a more extended period of time. Their fertility does decrease. Sperm quality decreases over time. But some men in their 50s, 60s, and 70s can, and some do have children. So Clint Eastwood, the actor, for example, I believe had a child when he was in his 70s, whereas a woman's fertility drops pretty dramatically with increasing age much more sharply than males. And so again, these are facts of our reproductive biology, and it would be totally astonishing, just to go back one slide, totally astonishing to an evolutionist if you have all these different features of human reproductive biology that are sex differentiated and absolutely no behavioral, psychological, or strategic sex differences that correspond to these biological differences in our reproductive systems. And as I'm going to show you, in fact, we do have sex differentiated sexual psychology. So let's turn to that sexual psychology now. What are the psychological, strategic, and behavioral sex differences? Well, since this is a relatively short talk, I'm only going to have time to talk about a few. But I'll mention some that I think are some of the most important ones. So, and I should say that sexual conflict occurs in three temporal contexts: before mating, after a mateship is formed, and during the aftermath of breakups. And in my book, I talk about each of these different phases and have chapters devoted to each, how people deal with conflicts within relationships, in the aftermath of breakups, and then when they're on the mating market. So for example, deception in internet dating. Number one, and this is the one I think that causes perhaps more problems and more conflict between the sexes than any other sex difference, and that is the desire for sexual variety. And what I mean by that is desire for a variety of different sex partners. So in this general sex difference, as many of you know, in the social sciences and even in the medical sciences, there's been a replication crisis. And where key studies fail to replicate, they fail to find the same findings that the original studies do. These you can take to the bank. These are solid, high magnitude of effect sex differences that are highly replicable across cultures. I'll just mention a few. So, how many sex partners would you like to have in your ideal world over the next 5 years, 10 years, your lifespan? How much time would you, if you found someone who you thought was attractive, how much time would you elapse before seeking sexual intercourse? What is the nature of your sexual fantasies? Do you fantasy about a wide variety of partners or a few? And there are sex differences therein. For example, men tend to do more what's called partner switching during the course of a single sexual fantasy episode. Patronage of prostitutes, almost exclusively 99% plus patrons are men. Not all sex workers are women, but the majority of them are. Can men and women be just friends? Well, we found that the answer depends on whether you're a man or a woman, because men have more difficulty being just friends with their opposite sex friend, because men tend to become sexually or romantically attracted to their opposite sex friend. And when that attraction is not reciprocated, it often causes conflict within the relationship and sometimes the termination of that friendship. And then this is something that's kind of shocking and abhorrent to me. I find a lot of this abhorrent, by the way. Describing the scientific findings of sex differences does not mean that I think they're a good thing. In fact, I think they're a bad thing and cause a lot of havoc in the world when it comes to sexual violence. But could you enjoy having sex with someone you hated? Men, if the woman's attractive, yeah, they don't have any problem with that. On average, women do. Those emotional components strongly affect women's sexual decisions more so than men's. Likelihood of consenting to sex after X amount of time is known. So if you've known the person 5 years, 2 years, 1 evening, 1 hour, across the horizontal axis, likelihood of having sex with that person. As you can see, if you've known the person 5 years, you find them attractive, both sexes agree, pretty high probability of sex. But for every time interval thereafter, the sexes depart, and you don't even have to calculate the statistics to see there's some that, women become very skeptical about sex at around 1 week, and men never do become very negative about it. And so this is just another expression of this desire for sexual variety. This is how many sex partners would you like to have? These are data that were collected by David Frederick. I've collected some. My colleague and former student David Schmidt, who's now at Brunel University as an eminent professor, he's collected some. But this is a minimum, ideal, and maximum number of casual sex partners. So this is on the left is number of sex partners desired. On the right is number of casual sex partners. And as you can see, again, you don't even have to do the statistics. There are these large, highly important and large magnitude of effects, sex differences in desire for sexual variety. Now, here we come to another finding, shifting gears. Men are more likely than women to overestimate their mate value. So these are studies, like there are studies done on OkCupid, for example, an online dating site, where how do men rate women? Well, they look kind of like a normal distribution. Some women they find very attractive, some women moderately attractive, some women less attractive. Whereas when you look at how women rate men, most men fall below threshold in attractiveness. So one way of saying that is that men on average find women more attractive than women find men. And this is a very important sex difference that there hasn't been much attention paid to it, but I talk about it in the book and what its consequences are. Men lower their standards when it comes to short-term mating. So in long-term mating, which we have long-term pair bonded mating, marital partners or long-term romantic partners. And both sexes maintain pretty high standards when it comes to these long-term mating relationships, but with casual sex, they drop their standards to, you could say, embarrassing levels. So minimum acceptable level of intelligence you would find in a partner. Women still maintain pretty high standards when it comes to a short-term casual sex or hookup. Men drop their standards substantially in that sexual context where there's low risk, low commitment, low involvement. Male sexual overperception bias. So there's some controversy about this, but my assessment of the scientific evidence is that it's a large, highly replicable sex difference, such that the typical example is woman smiles at a man and a man infers, oh, she's sending me a sexual signal. She's being seductive. She thinks she's sending me a cue that she's interested in me. And women, if you ask women, why did you smile? They're more likely to say, I'm just being friendly, or they're being polite, or they could even smile out of nervousness if the guy's a creep. So smile is inherently an ambiguous cue, but men tend to err in the direction of over-inferring sexual interest. And so Marty Hazelton and I, former student, now a professor at UCLA, we first discussed this in the context as one example of what we call error management theory. Error management theory, and those interested in the logic of that can look it up, and I talk about it somewhat in this book and other scientific articles. Not predicted is that women tend to underestimate. So this was basically a kind of like a speed dating paradigm where we brought men and women into the lab and we had them interact with each other and then separate them, and then they'd say, how sexually interested are you in this other person that you just interacted with? How interested are they in you? And so we were able to calculate discrepancies between those two, and women tended to underestimate. So they said, no, the guy I just interacted with, he's not interested in me at all. And the guys are saying, oh yes, I'm very interested in her. And we have a couple of hypotheses about why this is going on. So for example, men may intentionally suppress the overt expression of sexual interest because in fact, it tends to backfire as a mate attraction tactic to be too upfront and early on in the game, express overt sexual interest, and so they might intentionally conceal it. And so women are not getting the cues. Or it could, an alternative hypothesis could be that it is an adaptation in women to deflect unwanted sexual attention so that they literally don't see it. And so we can talk about that if you're interested. Now, it turns out not all men are equally susceptible to the sexual overperception bias. What we found in our study is that men high on narcissism, that is, they think they're hot, but they're not, They tend to overestimate their intelligence, attractiveness. They tend to be grandiose and have a sense of entitlement. And men who pursue a short-term mating strategy dispositionally, these are the men who are most likely to be vulnerable to the sexual overperception bias. And I think it's actually a design feature of short-term mating strategy, where if you are pursuing a short-term mating strategy and you believe that there are more women interested in you, then that is going to give you the confidence to approach women that you might otherwise avoid approaching. We found, we've done a whole research program with, this is Carrie Getz, Judy East, and David Lewis, and I, all professors, former students and now professors of mine, where we looked at attraction to cues of sexual exploitability, where we showed photographs of women who differ in their sexual exploitability. I had them rated on how exploitable they are, how deceivable, how seducible, how coercible, and then independently had them rate, a different panel rate, how attractive are these images as a short-term mate and a long-term mate. And what we found is that there are cues that men pick up on, like, is she intoxicated, sleepy, gullible, emotionally vulnerable? Does she appear low in cognitive capacity, young, immature, lacking bodyguards? These are cues that men, especially men who pursue a sexual exploitation strategy, pick up on and act on. But again, it's not all men. It turns out that men who are pursuing a short-term strategy, mating strategy, and men who are high on so-called dark triad personality traits, these are the men who are most attracted to sexually exploitable women. So I've already mentioned narcissism, which is one of the dark triad. Machiavellianism, these are people who pursue an exploitative social strategy. So they tend to be manipulative and view other people as pawns to be influenced and manipulated and moved around the board for their own selfish instrumental goals. And then psychopathy, so these are very bad dudes, far more overrepresented in men than women. These people tend to, one of the hallmarks of psychopathy is a lack of empathy. So most people have a sense of, like, let's say a child falls down and hurts his or her knee, or a puppy gets injured. Most people have a deep sense of empathy or compassion for the harms and suffering of the victims of these hurts. Psychopaths don't. They might laugh. They feel no sense of empathy. And it's like the most normal people have this empathy circuit, but in psychopaths, it's like it's severed in theirs. It does not exist. So it's this subset of men who are most likely to be attracted to sexually exploitable women. Here's just another sex difference. I'm shifting gears a couple of things just to try to give you a sense of the range of these sex differences. So how harassing is this act? Stared at her chest while talking to her, asked her if she would take off her clothes, leered as she walked by, told her about his sexual expertise, told her that if she would sleep with him, he would buy her an expensive gift. How harassing is this? Well, it turns out exactly the same acts, women view these acts as more sexually harassing than men do. And so even though they're the same acts, there's a sex difference. So this is some research that I've been doing with Anna Sedlacek, who just successfully passed her dissertation defense, but also some unpublished research that I did previously that found this sex difference. So, which is really, really important. And I'm going to come back to this in the concluding comments. One example, this is a real life example, that a supermarket chain in the United States developed this policy of superior customer service. And they instructed the clerks to smile and make eye contact with partners. Well, we know that these are going to be triggers of the male sexual overperception bias. This led to requests for dates, sexual propositions, and in some cases, stalking. And so women started filing, the workers, the clerks started filing sexual harassment lawsuits, and they finally eliminated the policy and it dramatically reduced sexual harassment. So this is just a practical thing about awareness of the scientific evidence of what leads to the male sexual overperception bias can be implemented to reduce conflict between the sexes, in this case, certain forms of sexual harassment and stalking and unwanted sexual attention. Men who are high in status, it's like a switch is flipped in their brains where they feel more sexual entitlement. Men who are high in status tend to overestimate their own attractiveness. They tend to feel lower empathy for their victims. And psychologist John Barge and colleagues have discovered this unconscious link between power and sexuality, especially among men who independently were self-reported most likely to sexually harass. Which men are sexual harassers? Well, by this point in the talk, it shouldn't surprise you. Men high on the short-term mating strategy, men high on dark triad traits. So again, it's not all men. I think many men or most men would feel that sexual harassment of women is ethically, is immoral, and would be appalled at the notion that they would engage in sexual harassment. And it turns out that a subset of men tend to be serial sexual harassers in the workplace and in other contexts. So it's not all men who are doing this, it's a subset of men. And now we know what at least some of the qualities are of this subset of men. Now, women have many defenses against sexual violence, and I devote an entire chapter in the book. And in fact, I think it's the longest chapter in the book because I think it's extremely important that we understand what the defenses are against sexual violence, which defenses are most effective in the modern environment and which are less effective. But I think some of these bodyguards, I think, has been an evolutionarily ancestral defense. That is, we evolved in small group living where women were surrounded by family, friends, kin. I've already mentioned, well, family is kin, and male and female allies who basically, by their mere presence, could deter forms of sexual violence. Now we have women by the thousands going off, moving across to different countries or across hundreds or thousands of miles to strange college campuses where they don't have these, what formerly would have been bodyguards of friends and family. And so there's a mismatch between ancestral and modern environments with respect to the bodyguards. But I think they're very important. Specialized fear of strange males, tonic immobility is a very important one. So it turns out that disturbingly, something like 30, 40, 45% of women who are rape victims tend to experience what's called tonic immobility, where their body, they feel they are literally unable to move. And the circumstances in which it occurs are when there is a high level of fear, and second, a high sense of entrapment, where the woman feels that she cannot escape this situation. And basically they experience this tonic immobility. And the reason that this is important is that it's an involuntary response, likely to be an evolved response. Some prey animals do similar sorts of things, have tonic immobility. But the reason it's important to understand is because sometimes women are blamed unfairly for, quote, not doing more. Well, why didn't you fight them off? Why didn't you do more? Well, this tonic immobility is an involuntary response to these high levels of fear, high levels of entrapment where there is no escape possible. And so I think knowledge of this defense can, at a minimum, help to avoid blaming victims of sexual coercion and violence, and also help victims to prevent blaming themselves, because some women do that. They would say, well, I should have done more. Why didn't I fight them off more? And this evolved defense, I think, can help explain that. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, one important question I raise in the book is, well, is this properly a disorder? Or does it have design features that have an adaptive logic that tell women, basically whisper in their brains, don't go over that hill again. So some of the symptoms are like sequestering in the home, fear of going out, even flashbacks of, the situations in which the sexual violence occurred. These, in fact, might be adaptive responses to avoiding future instances of sexual coercion. I'm not asserting that that is the case for sure, but I'm raising the hypothesis that it might be the case, and then we need to look into that further. Okay, so finally, suggestions for reducing sexual conflict, and that really is why I wrote the book. I think that, of all the work that I've done in my scientific career, which now spans 30, 40 years or so, I think that this is one of the most important things is reduction of sexual conflict. And I think deeper knowledge, scientific knowledge of the sort that Alice Dreger was referring to, we have to adhere to the scientific truth. Developing interventions to prevent sexual violence is not going to help if we are delusional about what the empirical state of the evidence, scientific evidence suggests. So first, we have to mind the gap. We have to have deep knowledge of sex differences in our sexual psychology. And historically, some people have been reluctant to admit or confront the notion of sex differences, I think for well-intentioned reasons. That is, people worry that if there are evolved sex differences, they will result in discrimination against women, of course, and we don't want that. But these are not sex differences in ability or talent or anything like that. They are sex differences in our sexual psychology. They're large in magnitude and profound, and we have to acknowledge them and come to grips with them. Sexual inferences and sexual emotions, just an example, and this comes up increasingly in the news, that men send unwanted photographs of their genitals to women that women find gross, they find disgusting. So one of the most common reactions that women have is, this is disgusting, this is gross. And men don't realize that fully. That is, some men send these photographs thinking that the woman is going to be turned on. It's a failure of mind reading. So that is, we use our own minds, our own sexual psychology, often to infer the sexual psychology of others. And men do find visual images of women's naked bodies, genitals, breasts, and so forth to be attractive. And so they erroneously think, whoa, women will also find, images attractive, and they typically don't. Sexual harassment codes and stalking laws. These are written according to, at least in American law, which is based on English law, according to what's called the reasonable person standard. Would a reasonable person view this pattern of conduct to qualify as sexual harassment or stalking? Both of these laws are written in with parallel kinds of language. Well, if it turns out that reasonable women and reasonable men differ, as they do, as I've argued that they do, then this has implications. Well, what if the judge is a reasonable man versus a reasonable woman? Or what if the jury consists of reasonable men versus reasonable women? They will come to different adjudications with respect to the outcomes of those accusations. And I think that a case could be made, and I've been talking to some legal scholars about this, that we need to get rid of this reasonable standard person, because there is no generic reasonable standard if the sexes differ in their assessments of these patterns of sexual harassment, and perhaps adopt a reasonable woman standard, since majority of victims of sexual harassment are women. Second, we have we have to recognize that there are profound individual differences. It's not all men and it's not all women. And I think that I've tried to emphasize that we know something important about the subsets of men who are most likely to commit acts of sexual violence. Fourth, we have to recognize that there are mismatches between ancestral and modern environments, and these create some adaptive problems while reducing others. I've mentioned one in the context of the bodyguards. That is, it's a mismatch between the social conditions under which women lived in small group living versus the modern conditions where we live in these large urban areas on college campuses where we don't, at least initially, don't have the bodyguards that we grew up with or that are our friendship networks and our family networks. And also another one is alcohol in concentrated forms, which is relatively recent in evolutionary history. Alcohol has been intentionally made for perhaps 7, 8, 10,000 years. Okay, but the high concentrations of it have not. And we also, of course, have date rape drugs like rohypnol, which are evolutionarily novel, that basically these things, alcohol and the date rape drugs, function to disable women's defenses against sexual violence. And then finally, men and women must cooperate. We have to cooperate and join forces to reduce sexual violence. And so there isn't a war between all men and all women as groups. It is individual men who are, and individual men in this case, who are perpetrating most acts of sexual violence, and individual women who are most likely to be victims. But the victims, those female victims, have male friends, male partners, a father, a brother, a son, male friends, and so forth. And so we are allied from an evolutionary perspective in some respects. And so we have to cooperate with each other to reduce sexual violence. And the final point that I want to make is an educational one. And I've been starting to talk with my own university at the University of Texas about this issue, that you cannot use introspection about your own sexual psychology to infer the sexual psychology of others, especially of the opposite sex. And we do, we're in some ways, we're stuck in the interiors of our own brains and minds. And if we use that introspection to infer the sexual psychology of others, we will be mistaken in many cases. So sexual violence, to return to the initial point, I think is the most widespread human rights problem in the world. Steven Pinker, who's I guess we're going to be hearing from, first noted this in one of his earlier books, and I thank him for that recognition. In an evolutionary perspective, I believe can help reduce sexual violence. So those of you who are interested can look at my new book, When Men Behave Badly, which is exclusively about conflict between the sexes, or if you're interested in human mating strategies more generally, my earlier book, The Evolution of Desire, Strategies of Human Mating. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'd love to take questions if you have them.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Thank you very much, Professor Buss. We don't have a lot of time to do all the questions, but we do have selected one question. Could the evolutionary perspective say something more about same-sex violence?
Yes, so my book focuses primarily, but not exclusively, on heterosexual individuals. But some of the things that I've been describing do in fact happen in same-sex couples, so among lesbian couples and among gay male couples. There's been far less research on these things. So one of the things that we do know, there's been research on male sexual jealousy as a cause of violence in gay male relationships. And it looks like it's very parallel to what occurs in heterosexual relationships. And there is, of course, violence and sexual violence in lesbian relationships that also occurs, but I'm hesitant to draw any conclusions about it simply because it has not been studied nearly enough. And one of the things I mentioned in the book is a call for more research on these non-heterosexual, on individuals with different sexual orientations.
Okay, thank you. Yes, it was very interesting. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go through all the questions. Thank you very much for your lecture.
Well, thank you. It's been a delight, and I would just say that anyone who, if you have questions, feel free to shoot me an email. Be happy to answer questions through email.
Great. Do we have your email in the chat maybe, or?
I can put it into the chat, or if you just Google my name, my contact information will come up.
Yeah, thank you. Wow, that would be great. Thank you very much.